Little Teddy Roosevelt started off life as a weakling. Born in 1858 into a wealthy New York family, young Teddy was plagued by severe asthma. The worst attacks came in the night, so violent his parents feared he would suffocate in his sleep. In an era before modern medicine, there were few remedies. He was thin, anxious, and often confined indoors. But there was one medicine that seemed to do well, and oddly enough, it transformed his life. It was simply his father's advice. Teddy Sr. gave him words that would guide and shape this scrawny, skinny, sickly kid into a man who would one day be an American icon of strength and courage. Teddy's father said, "You have the mind but not the body, and without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body." To which young Teddy must have thought, wait, I can just do that? Teddy trusted his father and decided then and there that he would make himself strong. There would be no excuses, no shortcuts. He began the life of strenuous pursuit. Teddy began lifting weights, boxing, hiking, rowing, often pushing himself well past exhaustion. He taught himself to ignore fatigue and erase doubt. That self-forged determination followed him to Harvard, where he boxed competitively despite being undersized. During one match, a blow permanently damaged his left eye. Roosevelt barely acknowledged it. He never complained, and he continued boxing even while in the White House. However, young Roosevelt's resolve and tenacity were about to be tested by two sudden tragedies. In 1880, Roosevelt married Alice Hathaway Lee. He adored her. Friends described him as openly, almost embarrassingly happy. Sadly, happiness would be brief. On February 14, 1884, Valentine's Day, his wife died from kidney failure just 2 days after giving birth to their daughter. On the same day, his mother died of typhoid fever in the same house. Roosevelt opened his diary and wrote a single sentence. Distraught, he left the comfort and familiarity of New York and fled to the American West to rediscover something he hoped he still had. Roosevelt went to the Dakota Badlands, a place of brutal winters, lawlessness, and raw survival. He invested in cattle ranches, dressed like a frontier cowboy, and slept under the open sky. He had visited the area about a year earlier on a buffalo hunt and admired it for many reasons, most importantly, the challenges it offered. He needed something to fight for, something to force him to rise out of his grief and meet the demands of survival. He got a lifetime of challenges. He rode through blizzards. He chased horse thieves. When criminals stole his boat on the Little Missouri River, Roosevelt tracked them down for days through icy conditions, captured them himself, and personally escorted them to jail with calm determination. His ranching venture failed financially. He lost much of his fortune, but he gained something far more valuable, a hardened identity forged far from the drawing rooms and the politics of New York. When he first arrived in the Badlands, it was obvious he didn't belong. By the time he left, having helped those around him through their own challenges and withstanding all that nature had thrown at him, he had earned the respect of those who didn't think he would make it. The frontier had given him something no institution ever could, proof that he could continue, act decisively under pressure, and rise to meet any challenge. Hey, if you like stories of adventure, inspiration, and innovation, please like and subscribe. It really encourages YouTube to help share the channel with other people who enjoy the same thing. Thanks. He carried those lessons back to New York, into rooms where stakes were no longer about survival, but power, corporate, political, and moral. As is typical of Teddy's entire life, he needed another challenge, which arrived right away. Soon after returning to the East, Roosevelt was appointed the New York City Police Commissioner. Upon his arrival, corruption was rampant. Officers slept on duty and bribes were routine. Roosevelt responded by walking the streets at night, unannounced, catching his officers in the act. He fired men, he defied political machines, he became deeply unpopular in powerful circles and quietly admired by the public. He said, "I've always had a horror of words that are not translated into deeds." That belief guided him relentlessly. Taking charge of the New York Police Department meant stepping into a system where corruption was not exception, but the operating principle, protected by powerful political machines and wealthy interests who depended on selective enforcement. The experience taught him that moral courage was not just personal bravery, but the willingness to challenge systems of power. In 1887, Theodore Roosevelt arrived in Washington as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He brought with him a hard-earned certainty. Systems fail not from lack of rules, but from lack of urgency and accountability. Just as he had found corruption thriving in the shadows of New York, he now saw complacency rotting America's defenses. An underfunded fleet, outdated ships, and officers unprepared for modern war. Roosevelt moved fast, pushing ship construction, improving gunnery training, stockpiling coal and ammunition, and quietly positioning fleets for rapid deployment, convinced that preparedness itself was a moral obligation. Though still officially second in command, his energy and clarity of purpose transformed the Navy into a disciplined, forward-looking force, one capable of protecting American power beyond its shores and ready, when war came, to prove that reform, when taken seriously, could alter the course of history. In 1898, Spain was occupying Cuba. Now, at this time, Spain was no superpower, but it didn't have to be. It only had to be strong enough to expose American weakness. Roosevelt understood that wars aren't lost to great enemies. They're lost to being unprepared. When the explosion of the USS Maine pulled the United States into war, the Navy Roosevelt had helped harden and modernize struck quickly, validating his relentless push for readiness. But the land campaign in Cuba bogged down in confusion, disease, and hesitation. Refusing to direct the war from the safety of D.C., Roosevelt resigned his powerful post and helped form a group called the Rough Riders, a cavalry consisting of cowboys, Native Americans, scouts, police officers, and Ivy League athletes, which sounds like an odd pairing of the Suicide Squad and the Village People. Teddy led them himself into the blistering heat and the chaos of battle. At San Juan Hill, with orders faltering and men pinned down, Roosevelt mounted one of the only horses they had and rode forward under fire, rallied troops from multiple units, and charged uphill into direct gunfire, turning paralysis into momentum. The hill fell. The moment became legend, and overnight Roosevelt emerged not as a reformer or a strategist, but as a man who would step into danger when others hesitate, a reputation that carried him home straight into the next, larger chapter of his life. Fresh from Cuba, Theodore Roosevelt returned to New York as a national hero, and party leaders had little choice but to ride his popularity. In 1898, he was elected governor of New York, stepping into office with the same instincts he'd shown everywhere else: confront corruption, weaken monopolies, and put the public interest ahead of entrenched power. He pushed for corporate regulation, labor protections, and reforms that alarmed party bosses who depended on these cozy relationships with railroads, insurers, and political machines. Roosevelt governed not as a caretaker, but really as a disruptor, and almost immediately, the men who controlled those systems began looking for a way to neutralize him. Their solution was elegant and, they believed, safe: promote him out of harm's way. By 1900, New York party leaders and national Republicans quietly conspired to push Roosevelt onto the presidential ticket as vice president, a role with prestige but almost no real power. The calculation was simple: elevate him, isolate him, and contain his reforming energy somewhere it couldn't threaten established corruption. Roosevelt accepted, and the McKinley-Roosevelt ticket won the election. The scheming of the corrupt worked for a moment, because in 1901, a little over 6 months later, President William McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt, just 42 years old, became the youngest president in American history. Many assumed he would be reckless and not ready for such a challenge. As president, Theodore Roosevelt wielded power with a confidence America had never seen, confronting monopolies that strangled opportunity, defying party bosses who tried to restrain him, and insisting that the government exists not to serve wealth, but to balance it. Roosevelt was a conservationist who cared for land and knew it was important to manage it wisely. However, his entire thought system was about to be quietly and patiently challenged by renowned naturalist John Muir. Muir knew Teddy was coming, but he also knew that what he wanted to say would be meaningless if Teddy was surrounded by aides, press, handlers, etc. So he hatched a plan. He waited patiently until the crowds and the entourage began to thin out a bit. Then he made his move. He and Teddy went for a walk, and Muir asked Teddy if he would like to go visit Glacier Point and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias. Teddy didn't hesitate. They went alone, with few provisions, camped under the stars, no tents, and were gone for a few days. Muir first let silence, the sound of the wilderness, and the allure of Yosemite work its magic, knowing Roosevelt could not be argued into preservation. He had to feel it, sleep beneath it, walk through snow among ancient trees older than the Roman Empire. Beneath the sequoias and the open sky, two men spoke not of profit or policy, but of humility, time, and the danger of confusing ownership with stewardship. Muir led Roosevelt through towering sequoias and snow-covered valleys, speaking passionately about the sacredness of wild land. Roosevelt listened, not as a politician, but as a fellow outdoorsman. Roosevelt left that camp changed, carrying with him a conviction that some land must remain untouched, not for sentiment, but for the soul of the nation. And from that quiet encounter would grow the most enduring legacy of his presidency, the protection of America's wild places as a trust held not for one generation, but for all who would follow. Muir wrote afterward, "I never before saw a man enjoy himself so heartily in the wild." Roosevelt said of that famous park, "There can be nothing in the world more beautiful than Yosemite." Under Roosevelt, 230 million acres of land were protected. National parks, forests, monuments, and wildlife refuges. No president before or since has come close to that type of effort. In 1908, Teddy stepped away from the presidency, believing that serving too long, even for a popular president, could cause issues and conflicts. And believe it or not, there's yet another insane journey awaiting this aging adventurer. After losing the election, Roosevelt sought one final test, an expedition down an uncharted Amazon tributary known as the River of Doubt. The journey could only be dangerous, exhausting, and possibly fatal. In fact, he was warned not to go, but adventure for Roosevelt was proof of relevance, which he needed or wanted. The 6-month-long expedition, co-led by Brazilian legend Colonel Candido Rondon and ex-President Roosevelt, quickly became a nightmare. Torrential rains, near vertical riverbanks, rapids that literally smashed their canoes to pieces, starvation, disease, and insects that burrowed into flesh turned progress into survival. Roosevelt himself was ravaged by malaria, infection, and an untreated leg wound that became gangrenous. At his weakest moment, delirious and burning with fever, he realized he was slowing the men down and putting them at risk. True to the code he had lived by his entire life, he told them to leave him behind, to save themselves and finish the journey without him. But there was one man who refused to give up, his son Kermit Roosevelt, who had already proven himself under fire, strong, steady, and resourceful, and now he made a quiet, unyielding decision on his own. He would not abandon his father. Against orders, against logic, Kermit stayed, rationed food, helped Roosevelt move, and quietly, literally carried him through stretches of the jungle. Without his son's determination, Roosevelt would have died in the Amazon jungle. The dangers did not end with disease and terrain. One member of the expedition murdered another in cold blood, then fled into the jungle, forcing the party to push on, knowing there was a killer on the loose somewhere behind them. When they finally emerged months later, the River of Doubt had been mapped, its existence confirmed for the world. Roosevelt returned permanently weakened, having lost weight, strength, and years off his life. He later admitted the expedition shortened his lifespan, but it also revealed something essential. Even diminished by age, Roosevelt remained what he had always been, a man who sought meaning in hardship, who placed responsibility above pride, and who, when faced with death, chose not glory but duty. The river of doubt was not his final triumph, it was his final test, survived not by force of will alone, but by trust in the next generation to carry him home. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Theodore Roosevelt, 58 years old, immediately offered to raise and lead a volunteer division to fight in Europe, much as he had done with the Rough Riders nearly 20 years earlier. He personally appealed to Woodrow Wilson, arguing that experienced, battle-tested leadership would inspire the nation and the troops. Wilson refused. The rejection devastated Roosevelt. He accepted the decision publicly, but privately, it cut deep. He would watch the war from home as all 4 of his sons served. One of them, Quentin, died in combat in 1918. Teddy Roosevelt's legacy can only be compared to a few other presidents, as his accomplishments and service easily place him on, well, the Mount Rushmore of presidents. His moral courage, ability to perform under pressure, wartime leadership, and unmatched conservation record cemented this cowboy, brawler, soldier, corruption fighter, and champion of the people and their land as an American icon. Teddy Roosevelt died peacefully in his sleep in 1919. Vice President Thomas Marshall famously said, "Death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight." Thanks for watching. McNutt out.